Hello everyone and welcome. This is the third discussion round of the exhibition project Fossil Experience, which is hosted by the communal Pratergalerie in Berlin. I'm Sonja Hornung. I curatorially advise the exhibition. The exhibition was curated by Lena Johanna Reisner, who would be introducing this event today. However, she's unfortunately unwell, so I'm jumping in at the last minute. I'm delighted to introduce the panel, which I will do shortly. Firstly, a couple of words about Fossil Experience itself. This was an exhibition project that just finished last Sunday that addressed a number of the wildly divergent and in part very violent realities generated by the use of fossil fuels in the context of the ongoing climate crisis. And this is the third of 4 discussion panels. There's going to be one more happening this same time next week on Thursday evening. So before I get into the context and the background of this discussion panel, just a little bit of housekeeping. This event is going to take place in English only. We've planned a short break of 5 minutes around halfway through, so around 7 p.m. so everyone can relax a little bit, walk around, go to the bathroom, come back, because we'll have long working days and these events definitely require full concentration, so it's good to have a break. There'll be a time at the end of the event for questions. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. If you would like to pose a question by typing in the, rather than using the chat, we'd like to ask you to use the Q&A function. And if you'd like to ask a question directly using video, that would be fantastic. Just raise your hands and the technical support will make you visible. Just be aware that this event is being recorded. So when Lena and I began preparing today's panel discussion, which is called Fossil Gas is Not Clean, it was around that time that the European Commission quietly declared gas, as well as nuclear, to be sustainable sources of energy, on the proviso that they would play a key role in the so-called energy transition to renewables. So that was in early February this year. And we weren't to know that 3 weeks later, Russia would invade Ukraine, and the question of gas and Western Europe's dependency on Russian gas in particular would suddenly preoccupy mainstream media and political discourse here in Berlin and Western Europe. So today we're going to hear from 3 panelists who have to do with context beyond that frame, beyond Berlin and beyond Western Europe. And our discussion will, to begin with, also shift the focus away from demands for, let's say, West European energy security at all costs. Rather, we'll be looking at the origins and repercussions of so-called natural gas along its supply chains. And I use the term natural gas or so-called natural gas and call it into question immediately, because this word natural is a misnomer that covers up the fact that gas is a fossil fuel and a fossil product. And at every point in the process of its extraction, production, transport and use, it emits greenhouse gases, including CO2 and methane, into the atmosphere. So calling gas natural misrepresents the danger that this presents in the context of ongoing climate crises. And that's why Lena and I decided to simply title the event with the statement, "Fossil gas is not clean," because we realize in daily conversations that this is something that constantly needs to be cleared up. In particular, we're going to be looking at fracking, which is banned in most parts of Europe, but which forms an increasing share of total gas consumption. We will also examine how in settler colonial contexts, in particular in the US and in Australia, gas extraction takes place in ways that violently contradict or attempt to circumvent the sovereign legal systems of First Nations, which leads us to the question of how cultural workers support and push calls for climate and environmental justice. So I'm delighted to very briefly welcome our 3 panelists. Christopher Basaldú is a climate activist and Eshtoknya of the Carrizo Comecrudo First Nation in Texas, from where the new LNG terminal that's being built at the moment in North Germany at Brunsbüttel is to be supplied with gas. Christopher has long experience campaigning in both Western European contexts and in his homelands in Texas. And it's a pleasure to have you here today, Christopher. Esteban Servat is a scientist and environmental activist in exile from Argentina who became an activist when confronted with fracking for gas in Vaca Muerta in Argentina. And he's also a co-initiator of EcoLeaks and Shale Must Fall, among other initiatives. And our third panelist, Rachel O'Reilly, is an artist and independent researcher born in Gladstone, Queensland in Australia, on the unceded lands of the Goring people. Rachel contributed a documentary to our exhibition entitled Infractions, which was made in dialogue with frontline Indigenous cultural workers in the Northern Territory in Queensland, so 2 states of the settler colony, Australia, as Indigenous cultural workers struggle against the threat of shale gas fracking. So that's the brief overview of our panelists. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Sumugan Sivanesan, who is moderating our discussion today, who will then introduce the panelists in more detail. But before that, I would like to introduce Sumugan, who is an anti-disciplinary artist, researcher, and writer who often works collaboratively. His interests including political ontology, activist media, minority politics, and more than human rights. Sumugan is currently developing Fugitive Radio as a platform for migrant, anti-colonial and queer issues and music in Helsinki, where he is right now, and beyond. In Berlin, he is a part of Black Earth, a collective addressing the interacting issues of racism, gender, colonialism, and climate justice. Sumugan earned a doctorate from the Transforming Cultures Research Centre at the University of Technology, Sydney in 2014, and was a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for English and American Studies at the University of Potsdam in 2016 to research urban eco-politics of the Anthropocene. So thank you very much, Sumugan, for accepting to moderate today, and thank you to the panelists for joining us. I'll pass the word on to you.
Thank you, Sonia. Yeah, so I suppose let's kick off with the panel. So it will follow the format of each of the panelists will speak for 10 minutes or so. Then we will take a short break followed by a Q&A. And as Sonia had outlined before, if you can put your questions in the Q&A button, press the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or raise your hands if you would like to ask a question on video. The session is being recorded, so if you do appear on video, you will be recorded as well. Okay, so our first panelist for today is Esteban, and I will just give another brief introduction. Esteban Servat is a scientist and exiled environmental activist from Argentina. After a decade working in the Silicon Valley, he returned to Argentina to build a self-sustaining community. When the government brought fracking into the region, which is part of Vaca Muerta, Servat became an activist. As a co-creator of EcoLeaks and an instigator of a massive anti-fracking movement, Esteban became the target of government attacks and was ultimately forced to leave Argentina. From Europe, he has continued his activism, building networks to connect environmental groups across continents and contexts. He has initiated and helped build movements and networks such as Shale Must Fall and the Global Coastline Rebellion. So Esteban, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Sumu. Thank you, Sonia and Lena, for organizing and inviting us and covering this urgent issue, giving it more coverage in the cultural and arts world at this time, which is a critical time. I'm going to start sharing my screen because I made a presentation for you. Please let me know if you can see it okay. Is it okay, Sumo? Okay. And obviously, in 10 minutes, I cannot really do justice to all of the data and the science and the human cost of what I need to tell you about. So some of these slides I will run over very quickly, but I wanted to give you this presentation, which I'm making available through Sumu and the organizers. So if anyone wants it, you can request it and you can have the references beneath each slide so you could do some further research on your own if you're interested in the topic. So as Sumo was saying, I come from Argentina, and I had to leave my country for confronting the advancing fracking industry. My case and the case of the other comrades that will talk about me after me, sorry, I'm running a little sleep, is pretty similar. We have a common denominator, which is frontline resistance to the advancing gas and fracking industry. And now, as Europe is going into war, and this war also has fossil fuels behind it, and gas has jumped to the mainstream conversation, it's not so much in the mainstream conversation the true impacts, climate and human impacts, that this will have on all of us and all of you here in Europe as well. That's why it's so important for me to make this presentation for you. So I was saying this is a story from the front lines of Vaca Muerta. You are welcome to read later more about this in an interview that I'm sharing here in this PowerPoint. And Vaca Muerta is located on the west side of Argentina. It's the world's second largest shale gas basin and fourth largest shale oil basin. It's huge. It's about the size of Belgium, and it's going to consume nearly 15% of the entire global carbon budget. So there you have a major carbon bomb being exploited by European and global north in general multinational oil companies, including Germany's Wintershall, that most people still don't know, and is the largest oil and gas company of Germany, doing a technique abroad that they cannot do at home, fueling the climate crisis with skyrocketing methane emissions and violating human rights, in this case of the Mapuche people, whose native land coincides with the borders of Vaca Muerta. So just to give you a general idea for any of you that may not be familiar with gas, there are different types of gas. And this triangle of resources on the left pretty much shows that conventional reservoirs of gas, which are what mostly has been extracted until now over the last century or so, is relatively smaller in volumes and easier to access. And as you go down this pyramid, you get larger volumes of availability and more difficulty to extract. As you can see down there, you have shale gas. Shale gas has been, especially in the last decade or so, with the inception of fracking, which is the combination of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, as you can see on the right image, has made it possible to really exponentially expand the availabilities of gas and oil. This is called the shale revolution, and it's leading to major energy and political changes in the world that is really important for us to explain to you, because this is a major component of the climate crisis, and we're headed for it to grow a lot more in the coming years unless we come together to stop it. So fracking, many of you may be familiar with this. This is one of the reasons it's not applicable in Germany and in most of Western Europe, yet Europe is outsourcing fracking to the rest of the world, especially the global south and indigenous territories of the global north, such as where Christopher is coming from. So fracking is devastating from wherever angle you look at it. It causes earthquakes, it contaminates water tables, it contaminates the soil, the air, the flow back water that comes back from the depths that could be 2,000 or 3,000 meters deep, like in the case of Vaca Muerta, often also brings back radioactive materials and heavy metals, together with the 600 or so chemicals that are used already in the mix in order to break this rock. It's called hydraulic fracturing because it's about fracturing this really dense shale rock in order to liberate the gas and oil bubbles that are trapped there for millions of years in order for them to be extracted. So everything used in this process is extremely toxic. It causes cancer, all kinds of illnesses. In Vaca Muerta, children are dying of leukemia at a rate that is 3 times higher than the national average in the places where the wells are located. So, and the amounts of water consumption are also a huge impact on the environment. It nearly consumes 40 million liters of water per well during the lifetime of a well, and most of this is irreversibly contaminated. The so-called shale revolution is something really important to show you here. It started in the US and it's mostly been led by the US, also Canada, and expanding around the world, such as in my country, Argentina. They want to do it in the Okavango. They're doing it in Australia, as we will hear later. But as you can see here from the US Energy Agency, official projections that shale gas is taking over as the major source of production of gas going forward. And that's the source of most of the gas that the US is exporting to Europe today, coming from fracking. This is also a very general graph that shows globally the sources of conventional versus unconventional fossil fuels, how this proportion is shifting as time passes. As I was showing you earlier, unconventionals are taking over, but there's a climate and human cost associated to this that we need to tell you about now. So what's coming to Europe from the US, from Argentina, and from Australia and other places is coming in the form of LNG, which means liquefied natural gas, which we know is not natural. They compress this gas about 600 times by freezing it down to minus 160 degrees Celsius, and they load it on these huge transoceanic tankers that are also extremely contaminating and using very heavy fuels. And this process alone has been shown to add nearly additional 20% carbon footprint to the LNG that is transported from the Americas to Europe. Now, the shale revolution has allowed countries like the US to become, they say, energy independent. So they don't need to import as much oil and gas from the Middle East, and instead they're destroying their own homelands, but they're only destroying the homelands of indigenous people and people in the rural countryside. But it's allowed the US to become a major and the leading exporter in the world of LNG. Now, what this means for the planet and for all of us is that look at this map. This is how the new fossil fuel frontier is expanding into the unconventionals over the last few years. And as you can see, the amounts of available reservoirs of oil and gas are immense, a lot more than even what's left of the conventional oil and gas. So you may remember a decade or more ago that people were talking about the peak oil time in the world. That was supposed to be when the production of oil could reach a peak, and then oil was supposed to get more expensive, and maybe a transition would become possible because people would invest in renewables. But fracking has been developed to save the fossil fuel industry, to perpetrate the life of the fossil fuel industry for decades to come at the expense of our future and our present in the global south, and at the expense of the planet. So there is no way that we can allow this to go on. And we need all of the European climate movements and civil society to come together, because this is not only outrageous, but this is waging war on humanity and the planet. So shale gas in general is similar to coal in its carbon footprint. One of the biggest lies is that this is clean, that this is some kind of transition fuel. The methane emissions of gas make it similar to coal in its carbon footprint. And when it comes from fracking, it's actually the worst fossil fuel of all, as I will show you briefly. Now, there's been many studies. One of them was a groundbreaking study by Dr. Howard from Cornell University a couple of years ago, showing that nearly 50% of all increased global emissions of methane over the last decade were coming from attributable to fracking. Or more than 1/3 of the total increase when you take into account all sources, not only fossil fuels, but also biological sources. This is huge. When you consider that now people are talking about methane and reducing methane emissions. So when you take all of this into account and you compare the carbon footprint of the different types of fuels, gas is similar to coal, and actually shale gas, as I said earlier, is by far the worst fossil fuel of all. So how can you tell me, how is it possible that the German government, the EU Commission, and most governments in Europe and everywhere around the world are selling this down our throats as some kind of renewable or transition fuel that is cleaner than coal? Well, part of the trick is that they tell you in Europe, yeah, this burns cleaner than coal here in Europe because it produces less CO2. Of course, it's made of methane. And most of the emissions in the cycle are not made in Europe. They're made in Texas, they're made in Argentina, they're made in Australia, and this is not taken into account into the carbon footprint of the product. So this is how, by localizing and having always a nationalist agenda, nationalist look, we are always getting worse and worse into what has led us to the climate crisis in the first place. Now, by far, gas and fracking have been the largest contributors of methane from all of the fossil fuel industry in recent years. And you must know that methane is 87 times more potent than CO2 in its global warming potential over the first 20 years in the atmosphere. We don't even have 20 years to change the course. And the fact that methane continues to skyrocket and that they are pushing the expansion of gas and fracking all over the world, it's really a declaration of war on the planet. So what's happening in Europe? Even before the war of Ukraine, Europe was already multiplying its LNG import infrastructure everywhere. And they're doing this with your money, with euros from tax money, financing it, subsidizing it, putting them on the PCI list so that they can be considered as strategic projects and skip lawsuits and be expedited. Now this is actually outdated, but now it's multiplying. For example, in Germany, 2 months ago or so, until 2 months ago, there was nearly 2 planned LNG terminals that we have already been fighting over the last couple of years, like with Ende Gelände and Shale Must Fall last year in Brunsbüttel. Well, now, because of the war, they have multiplied to nearly 11, and some already beginning construction because they're in a rush. Now, most of this will not even go online until 2024, 2025, because it takes time. So it's complete insanity. This is not going to save Germany from the dependency on Russian gas. It's actually going to lock Germany in and Europe into more decades of dependency on a fossil fuel that is destroying the planet. And vice versa, it's an opportunity for all of us to come together and actually push for a renewable future for Europe, where they put the real amount of investment needed to get out of fossil fuels altogether and connect that as the only way that Europe can have peace. And this is what we need to do. So just to show you how the Commission and the EU are just selling false solutions, they're claiming that LNG is a good solution for the planet and the climate, and that it has actually helped reduce emissions in the maritime sector. And yet the very International Maritime Organization is acknowledging that there's been a 150% increase in methane emissions because of the use of LNG in the maritime sector. And things like this are happening all the time. These are also some more studies that are showing the same, that are all pointing to the fact that the boom of fracking in the world over the last decade or so has been linked to the methane spikes in the world. And in the bottom, you can see some of the flaring and venting of greenhouse gases that happens continuously, but you cannot see them unless you use an infrared camera, like they did in this case from Earthworks in the US. So at the same time, we are confronted with the science is actually saying, finally, you know, the IPCC that has been mostly quiet about this for decades and for years, is now come out to say we need to do some drastic methane cuts. And yet, at the same time as they're doing this, you have the COP26 in Glasgow, you have the EU and the US leading, championing the global methane pledge, committing to reducing methane emissions by 30% by the end of this decade. Yet at the same time, COP was sponsored by one of the leading methane emitters of the United Kingdom. And it had just been shown a few days earlier, a scandal. It was leaking methane all over its infrastructure in the UK. So this is the kind of double standard and cognitive dissonance that we are facing. They are playing us like a piano. If there is no global methane pledge, it's a lie. When fracking and gas is advancing all over the world, it's about time that we call their bluff and that we hold them accountable, because they are just lying one way or another. So I'm almost done because I know I don't have a lot of time, but also want to show some of you that may not know this, but fracking has so many connections to other industries like plastics. So the boom of fracking has allowed for a huge amount of ethane to become available at very cheap rates. Ethane is the raw material for a lot of plastics. And for example, in the US alone, plastics production is increasing by 30%. And it's happening all over the world as well. So if you care about the oceans, if you care about less plastics all over the world, then you also need to fight gas and fracking, because that's the origin of all of this. And then the human rights violations that I was referring at the beginning, you know, you can all read more in these references that I'm putting here. The Mapuche people are the ones paying the highest price of fracking in Argentina, and also other locals that are non-native, but there's a lot of consequences, including my case is just a small example of what's happening to anyone that dares to confront the advancing industry and the corporations that are mostly European and North American. So a little more than a year ago, we brought these groups together from around the world in the coalition called Shale Must Fall, a play on words with Shell Must Fall. It's another movement against Shell that is part of this as well and inspired by them. And we started connecting the dots, and we did a global action, a couple of global actions already with Ende Gelände, connecting the supply chains, because you need to show the devastation, the human rights violation, and the cost that this gas has to people in Europe because they don't see it. And, you know, it's out of sight, out of mind. And the Global South has a lot of stories to tell, and the indigenous peoples in the Global North that are really important. That's why I'm very grateful that you are allowing us here to amplify this in Berlin. So these are just some pictures from the global action we did last summer with Ende Gelände, and we're coming back. So I want to also use this opportunity to invite all of you, even if you are not ready to go to a civil disobedience action, you can always support this in one way or another. If you are from Fridays for Future, you can organize a demo in Berlin or in Frankfurt or in any other cities of Europe and help amplify the same message. It doesn't matter the tactics so much. What matters is that all of us should come together behind a common cause, because time is running out, and it's not just human rights, but the planet that need this to stop immediately. So thank you very much. There's my contact, and you can get the presentation if you contact the organizers.
Thank you, Esteban. That very informative presentation. We'll be collecting questions in the Q&A. So if you just save your questions until after the panelists present, and we will address them all together in the end. And Esteban has posting some details into the chat as well. And I think I will move on to the next panelist now, who is Christopher. Christopher Basaldú, a PhD, is Eshtoknya, a human being, a member of the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe of Texas. Apologies for my mispronunciations there. Christopher was raised in Brownsville and in Corpus Christi, Texas, and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in the study of religion from Harvard University. And he went on to earn a Master of Arts in American Indian Studies and a Doctor of Philosophy and Anthropology, both from the University of Arizona. Dr. Basaldú currently lives in Brownsville and proudly stands with his tribe and community to protect sacred sites, sacred homelands, and sacred waters. Christopher, the panel is yours.
Mautapele menoazol kayen sepen kepanikla yen estokna yen somisek. Hello everybody, good evening, guten Abend. My name is Christopher. I am a member of the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe of Texas. That name, of course, was given to us by Spanish invaders and colonizers into our homelands. And I lived in the settler colonial town of Brownsville, Texas. And the sort of colonization and exploitation of my homelands has been ongoing for a couple of centuries now. We call our homelands Somisek in our language, and it doesn't just mean Texas. The boundary, the sort of Eurocentric boundary between the United States of America and the United States of Mexico, that's a settler colonial imposed boundary. The lands of Somisek, the Eshtokna people, Eshtokna means human being, human person. So our homelands are on both sides of that river. What's known as the Rio Bravo in the United States of Mexico the Rio Grande in the United States of America. It's Ahumatametel, the spirit river to our people, and it's not a boundary. It's the river that connects villages to village, you know, ancestrally before the invasion and genocides. It's also the river that connects us to all the other Native and Indigenous people that live along the river on both sides, you know, for that entirety of the river. And, you know, my elders have taught us that the origin point, the creation point of our people is the mouth of that river. So it's literally the being, the life force that connects us not only to other people and our ancestors, but to other forms of life, you know, all the other species that depend on this fresh water to live and survive. And it's the spot where our people come from, at the mouth of the river. So it's sacred. It literally connects us through time and space to our ancestors and our future generations, right? And, you know, being Native, being an Indigenous person means living relationships with respect, being a good relative, not just to our human relatives within the tribe, but all our Native and Indigenous human relatives, and all of our relatives, plants, animals, birds, fish, the lands, the waters, the air. All of these, we're all related and interconnected to each other. And it is the purpose of a human being to be a good relative, to bring life, give life, support life, not harm it or destroy it or damage it. So in Brownsville, Texas, right now, there are 2 proposed LNG export terminals. And of course, local community members, people of color, Native and Indigenous people like our tribe, you know, this is our sacred homeland. And even for de-indigenized people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, for people who may not know their ancestry, there's still a lot of people in the United States and Mexico who may not identify themselves as Native American, but their ancestry is Indigenous and Native. Colonization has forced them to forget who their ancestors are in order to survive in this exploitative, white supremacist, Eurocentric economy, this global economy based on destroying Native and Indigenous homelands, stealing those resources, and enriching the wealth of Europe. The United States, the European United States of America, was begun as a colony, a settler colony, in order to take wealth back to Europe. And using fracked gas from any place in the Western Hemisphere, any place in Africa, all taking that gas, destroying the land, poisoning the water with fracking chemicals, all of that just to produce the wealth of Europe and the comfort of Europe and the wealth and comfort of European settler colonists in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, in Argentina, in Chile, in Bolivia, all of these places, in Brazil. These are European or European devoted, white supremacist devoted people to hold up this global system that creates misery for Native and Indigenous people, that destroys Native and Indigenous people's lands. How did Europe's resources and wealth get under my land and the lands of other Native people? We literally have a global economy that's based on murder, genocide, theft, rape of human beings, rape of the land, rape of the water. And it needs to stop because we're driving the planet to get to a point where human life or human civilization will be unsustainable. It already is unsustainable. We're already causing climate catastrophe just from what rich human beings have done in the past 200 years. So we're trying to fight the development of these 2 LNG export terminals that would send fracked gas to Europe. And it's not just building those terminals on pristine wetlands and sacred homelands where there are ancestral villages and of our people on the coast. But it's also that the industry has to build the pipelines to connect fracked gas in the Permian Basin, in the area called the Eagle Ford Shale deposit, which is in our homelands. Fracking it, and then you have to collect it and then put it in pipelines and then send it to new export terminals to go to the import terminals and infrastructure in Europe or into the global market. We're trying to stop that from happening, because if these are built, they will destroy not only environment and put pollution into our community and poison our land and destroy fishing and shrimp and destroy life, but these facilities that we're trying to fight in Brownsville will also literally destroy archaeological historic sites of our ancestors that are not being acknowledged as being there. And I want to say that all of the Western Hemisphere, all of it, all the islands, all of it is native land. All of it is indigenous land. All of that land is stolen from native people, and the exploitation of their labor and the exploitation of their land is theft. And so the comfort of rich white people in America, rich white people in Canada, rich white people in Mexico, the comfort of rich white people in Argentina and all of Europe, all of it is at the cost of destroying the lands and environments of native and indigenous people throughout the entire hemisphere. So, we're fighting these, building out all this infrastructure for oil and gas. We're fighting export terminals. We're fighting pipelines here on this side of the planet, because across this ocean, you have to fight the import terminals in Europe. You have to fight the import terminals. That means fighting the governments. That's fighting the banks that finance these things. It's fighting, the industries that market these things as climate solutions when they're not. They're false solutions. And I want to add that all of these projects, at least in the United States for sure, none of that wealth creation or comfort creation comes to the people. None of it. None of it. It all goes to it's all private industry in the United States. So it's just making the board of directors of these private companies obscenely wealthy. None of that wealth is shared, because it's the United States. The United States doesn't share anything but misery. Anyway, I know I've probably spent more than my time. I want to just give you a taste of the humanity, the fact that native and indigenous people have been fighting extraction for centuries. I myself, I'm just new. I'm just one person. I'm still young. I haven't been fighting these fights the way generations upon generations of people have been fighting. There's fights all over the United States. There's the fight against Enbridge's Line 3 and Line 5. There's been the very famous resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, where almost every single native and indigenous nation in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly in the North America, sent people and delegates to fight that pipeline. And still the United States government ran that pipeline down native people's throats. All of these battles are interconnected. All of life is interconnected. So we're fighting export terminals. In Europe, you have to fight the import terminals, because everybody will lose when the climate becomes unsustainable for human life. I want to say thank you for the organizers. Thank you everybody for being here. And when we say goodbye to each other in our language, we say ayama payasel, and that means give life. So we even reminded ourselves in our language to give life, not give death or give harm. So give life, ayama payasel.
Thank you, Christopher. And for reminding us too how these connections work, both in terms of relations and also in terms of infrastructure, I think is really important to emphasize here. And with that, I'm going to move on to our last panelist, who is Rachel O'Reilly. Rachel is an artist, writer, independent researcher, curator, and educator born in Gladstone, Queensland, Australia, on the unceded lands of the Gurung people. Her work explores relationships between art and situated cultural practices, media philosophy, and political economy. In the last decade, she has focused increasingly on infrastructures of art and energy, questions of law and governance, and urgencies of planetary survivance. Her artistic research project, The Gas Imaginary, from 2013 to 2019, which was featured in the Fossil Experience, used poetry, animation, installation, documentary filmmaking, and public lectures to explain the racial and ecocidal logic of unconventional fossil gas fracking expansions in settler colonial space. Rachel teaches at the Dutch Art Institute and is a PhD researcher at the Centre for Research Architecture, Goldsmiths in London. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks Esteban, Christopher, Samu and Sonia for bringing us together. I didn't actually prepare so much just because I think it's important to listen to the two speakers and before me, and I'm just going to kind of maybe touch on some things from the context in which I work, which follow up on some of the points that have been made so clearly. So it's 3 a.m. here, and I rarely present on this film in particular without Indigenous colleagues, but they have put so much work into the film and their film tour. And you can see actually the film itself is now fully available for free on the website, infractionsdocumentary.net. And there's also the tour presented to Indigenous respondents across Australia when we toured, and also in London and Berlin. Q Kenny came from Aranda country to introduce the film there. So that's all recorded on the website if you want to have a listen. Yeah, the challenge of clean industry, that's a fundamental settler fantasy, as we know. A lot of the talking and thinking that I do from a non-Indigenous position around this industry and this infrastructure is thinking about the setup of corporate power and the relationship of corporate power to Indigenous rights and sovereignty, because we don't need to speak for Indigenous people to think about colonial critique and corporate critique. And there's plenty of work to do in that domain if you're interested in Indigenous livelihoods and Indigenous cultural defences, etc. The film Infractions follows the geography that connects actually the city where I grew up, called Gladstone, which is actually called the Yalam in Gurung language, which means city of shells, and it's a very large natural harbour that has actually been historically always connected to the frontier scape of Northern Territory and Western Australia, because it was a transit point for the colonists from the south to connect their cattle and coal, to offshore markets, essentially. So that's a very old industrial geography, if we want to think about it in that way. The Beetaloo Shale Basin, which is the largest current basin speculated upon in Australia, from which a lot of the speakers in the film are talking to, is of a similar size of the shale basin that Esteban mentioned in his presentation. And it's a similar kind of degree of methane emissions and carbon accounting that we're looking at. From the kind of geopolitical perspective, the first onshore unconventional gas approvals in Australia were actually planned in 2009, and they came through this city where I grew up called Gladstone as LNG infrastructure in the context of Obama era policies that were focused on the maintenance of American power through the control of energy, and an attempt, you know, which has been happening since 1973 in particular, and the oil embargo of that year, to basically pull American power away from dependence on the Middle East, and increasingly to think through Southeast Asia. So we had an Australian Prime Minister at that time who was wanting to put a tax on mining corporations and corporate power, actually more broadly, to get them to pay actual tax in Australia. Currently 85% of mining companies in Australia are not Australian owned, and the profits all go offshore and the tax is very minimal. The Prime Minister was ousted the same day that the Australian gas deals were signed offshore in China, pressured by BG Group, formerly British Gas, to sell those contracts to China. So the extent of power over, you know, sovereign national decision making that is involved in these kinds of contracts is quite extreme, and this is why also, you know, that Prime Minister campaigns over media ownership, because there's such a tight link between the corporate oil power and the corporate media networks, which was made particularly evident in, you know, 2 years before those contracts were signed for onshore gas in Australia. The Northern Territory was subjected to a major intervention into Indigenous lands that wasn't connected at the time to energy industry at all. Instead, it was a fake media story of sexual abuse in Indigenous communities that was completely fabricated and used to rationalise sending the military into Indigenous territories, recognised Indigenous territories, and also rewrite land laws and financial management instruments to essentially encourage smaller Indigenous communities and the infrastructure that's involved in those communities to move to the cities and get further away from their country. Now it's understood more broadly by the activists, by the people in those places, and, you know, by the broader kind of environment movement in Australia, that the intervention is extremely connected to the interests of companies across the north of the country in the water underneath those lands. And interestingly, I was asked to speak a little bit about the relations between settler and Indigenous activists in those spaces. From my own position, I mentioned that I grew up in the place where the LNG infrastructure was built, but I was also working at the State Museum when it was sponsored by one of the biggest gas companies. And we were presenting, you know, non-Western contemporary art practices, Indigenous contemporary art practices, while not saying anything about what was actually happening on the country, of those, you know, cultural practices that we were trying to promote, essentially, and contextualize. And so it was at that moment, my work as a cultural worker, I became much more interested in, you know, in the kind of infrastructural understanding of cultural practice from a non-Indigenous position, and the kind of responsibility that we have actually to commit to the reproduction of cultural practice, knowing with the full understanding that all Indigenous people are cultural workers. Most of them are not paid cultural workers, and the defence of the land and water on which we absolutely depends on that cultural work. So that's kind of my position. You know, we work in spaces alongside Indigenous artists and curators that hold that position ordinarily. So if we're not, you know, pulling our load in that regard, I think it stands out. So having said that, when I explained the relationships in the film to people from outside the geographies that, you know, outside of these geographies that are well known. I think it's important to remember that Liberals tend to historicise land rights in Australia as a partial victory for Indigenous people only at the centre of the country, which is kind of true. There was an attempt by the most progressive government in Australian history to return land to Indigenous people at that time. His name was Gough Whitlam. But there was a very quick backlash from the mining companies and the pastoral industry that organised together in an unprecedented way at that time to make sure that the threat of returning land to Indigenous people didn't become a full national reality. So what actually happened was that land was given back to communities in the places where the capitalists didn't think that they wanted to develop, and across the rest of the country, essentially the future possibilities to make money from Indigenous land were securitised more strongly. And it became more possible for more kinds of non-Indigenous capitalists to make more kinds of money from more kinds of legal uses of the land across the country. And 70% of the country is actually farmland. And a key kind of typology of land in that moment was pastoral land, so not land that farmers owned, but land that farmers leased. And a lot of the land that's currently under threat is, doubly and triply occupied by recognised Indigenous communities with pastoral leasing agents, and then mining companies trying to come over the top of that. So it's a layered kind of juridical situation. And, it's important to not be too romantic about the collaborations that are involved here. So pastoralists will, sometimes see it in their interest to recognise the moral and historical rights of Indigenous people on their property to be fighting the same company that they don't want to destroy the water. At the same time, land is not being given back in those places, and the difference between Aboriginal, recognised Aboriginal freehold land and native title recognition is quite different. With native title, as I show, as when I go to Ray Dixon's country in Newcastle Waters, he's standing in front of his sacred water meeting place where a lot of the tribes meet near his country, which is historically was a major space of the land rights activism, where they met to talk about resisting and walking off the pastoral properties in that moment. Remarkably, a lot of those historic sites of walk-offs that were responsible for actually delivering land rights in the country are not freehold Aboriginal land. So they're on native title, and they can't say no to mining companies, even though, those people and their ancestors are fully, remember the victories of previous decades of legal rights to land returns. I also wanted to mention that it's not just the Beetaloo Basin. There's fracking happening all over Australia except for Victoria. And I purposefully wanted to connect the Queensland story to the Northern Territory story because it's a racist geography that only imagines Indigenous people at the centre of the country, when more than 50% of Indigenous people live in urban territories on the East Coast, and they have just as equal rights to country as everyone else, every other Indigenous person in the country. So these are the kinds of, complex debts that we need to deal with. I think that is enough for now. I really appreciated the presentations before the global. A lot of the time, we're not allowed to connect the dots, or there's not enough time to connect the dots. And I really appreciate, I've been purposely working in cultural spaces to talk about this industry for a while, because it is, for better and for worse, it is a place where dots can be connected in different ways. And I just wanted to say, in particular, it's important to be very direct about some of the things that we're dealing with, not only because, time is paramount, but because, the moment of art's own autonomy, from its conditions of production, I think we all should be understanding that that moment was itself a modernist fantasy that we can't afford to deal with anymore. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel, for bringing it back to what we do here also as cultural workers, and as all of us here are non-Indigenous cultural workers who have been involved in Preta at least. So let's begin this panel discussion. So I'll just wait a few more seconds till a few more people come up here. Okay, I have a couple of questions just to kick off this discussion. Just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, and if you do want to direct them specifically at anybody, if you could also just make note of that in the Q&A as well. And if you would like to ask a question again to our panelists, just raise your hand using the raise hand button and I will pick you up. So just to kick us off, actually my first question was to Esteban, and Esteban, I know you might have to leave a little early as well. But again, I was impressed by the way that you spoke to this kind of false accounting of carbon emissions at the point where fracked gas is produced, which is not accounted for in where it's burnt, and also the release of methane, which is not often accounted for, and then also this link between ethane and plastics and the increase in the availability of, or the source material for plastics in the production of LNG as well. And I was thinking how this relates also to more recent kind of scientific rebellions, how this kind of information, I think it's come up in the chat, is, things that is not widely known, especially now with the kind of mass, larger awareness of gas and the politicization of gas with the Ukraine. How these kinds of knowledge is being, how movements like the scientific rebellion itself are sort of activating this kind of knowledge and trying to popularize that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that's a very good question, and I personally feel the role of scientist rebellion, it has a huge potential, because people all over the world, they still have respect for scientists and not so much for politicians. So I think that scientists leading by example, putting our bodies on the line and taking direct action could actually be the alarm bells that people need to hear to wake up more people quickly enough. So I'm really happy to see this movement growing, and the recent wave of actions that they did all over the world had a lot of impact. And I'm also happy they are very supportive of our campaigning. We haven't yet done a campaign on this with them, but I'm pretty hopeful that we will very soon, and hopefully the global action we're planning for the summer with Ende Gelände and Shale Must Fall and as many groups around the world as we can, we all need to come together. So I think scientists will have a key role to play, whether it's in that action or in any other actions, because this topic is just not in the media. This topic is just not, nobody knows it, and Sumo, you've also been in gas activists. We've been talking about this for years, and especially even now that it's a mainstream topic, gas is a mainstream topic, but the true costs of gas are not. So we have to make it, and for that we need to come together with all the climate and environmental movements. You're muted.
I mean, I think I was also just seeing your presentation again. I was also surprised at how much, I mean, I've heard this argument about methane before, but it had completely popped out of my mind over the last month with the way the you know, I think the way that even we began this panel around how gas is now being discussed at least as a clean energy or transitional energy source here in Europe, even though there is a push towards renewables, gas is still being argued for as a kind of essential clean energy. Yeah, I'm just wondering more about you know, how we can better emphasize these. I know, you know, movements are trying to do so, but, you know, put them on the table in these sort of policy discussions or these political discussions as well, you know. Yeah. And I don't know, Rachel, I don't know if you have anything to add to that as kind of cultural workers, you know, in the context that we're sitting on here now. I know you've thought maybe something around those.
Yeah, I mean, you know, art is not necessarily the best space to organize people, but it is, you know, it still can be unscripted and not entirely dominated by corporate power. So I think in that sense, it's useful because of that reason. In the context in which I've been working, meeting really committed scientists has actually been the thing that has kept me going sometimes, because the activists are getting tired and then a new scientist will come along and, you know, run straight into the censorship and be kind of shocked. And their kind of disciplinary authority and their genuine you know, concern with a certain degree of mediation can kick things on. That's happened recently with the groundwater studies of the a lot of the time, particularly outside the cities, a lot of the groundwater isn't fully mapped when these projects are approved. So there's been groundwater studies of groundwater dependent ecosystems, and whole new species are being discovered at the moment with mining industry money. That is actually challenging the future of the mining industry in those places if the science is, you know, is listened to and taken seriously. So the stegofauna research that's Jenny Davis is doing in Australia is really important, and she has she's kind of nearing the end of her career, and she's committed to continuing to speak up and educate the public around those groundwater dependent ecosystems regardless of the consequences to her career. And you can see that with a lot of, you know, there are settler scientists, and particularly women scientists were key in turning around collaborations with Indigenous people in New York State around the fracking there. Yeah, I just think the relationship of the science capture to media ownership is really key, and using art spaces to, you know, connect to other spaces is important. Not just staying within these spaces is the main thing, I think. I mean, now in Australia, the gas industry owns the research arm of the energy research of the formerly independent national science body. It massively funds the Department of Meteorology to the extent that it tells the Department of Meteorology how to talk about major weather events. So those connections are also really important as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, that's really important to remember too, that these industries do have a lot of have this kind of influence, this astonishing kind of influence over states and also the media and also scientific organizations as well. And I'm always just reminded too in Australia how whenever things like you know, Aboriginal rights or land rights or any of these or even these opposition to fracking or coal or these kinds of extractive industries come up, that the mining sector often emphasizes the threat to industry sovereignty as well, and how all these things threaten industry sovereignty and in a way emphasize, you know, their capacity and their power.
Yeah, I mean that that would also be a question for Christopher, I think, because I think, you know, the collaborations that we see in the media are actually corporate you know, projects collaborating with Indigenous funding initiatives that create relationships of dependency that the corporations hope, you know, are uncritiquable. I'll give an example. You know, there's been increased wildfires in bushfires in Australia. There's been increased funding towards bringing back traditional burning practices, for example. And the gas companies are, of course, first in line to be helping fund the return of really important cultural burning practices to, you know, major areas of forest across the country. And, you know, it hopes that it makes those gas projects uncritiquable from an Indigenous position. And a lot of white activists who aren't fully aware of that degree of manipulation will also think that those contracts are not critiquable, right? So talking about the problematic of the corporate funding of those projects assumes that it puts those cultural burning practices at risk. I am of the opinion that you know, we need to always aim at those really insidious attempts at manipulation, because obviously, you know, critiquing the corporate power is very different to critiquing a cultural burning practice. I don't know if you have examples like that, Christopher, that you deal with.
I don't deal with those directly, but I want to add that, yeah, I mean, people who have captured so much wealth are going to be controlling power structures. When the power structures in Australia, when the power structures in the United States have literally been built upon the extraction of wealth at the expense of Indigenous people. So every form of institution, whether it's educational, cultural, legal, governmental, all of those institutions are simply, you know, you can't ask a tree to grow as grass, right? So, you know, these systems were birthed in genocide, literally birthed in murder, literally birthed in enslavement and forced labor. So all the logics that exist in the United States, including media, including corporations, are not only about extracting wealth for the very small few, but in erasing Indigenous people's languages, cultures, practices, until they become like momentarily fashionable and can be used as a marketing tool to create the image that we're somehow inclusive or diverse of Native people, all while making sure that Native people have no avenue of resistance left available to them. I would want to add to your corporate critique, I want to add a critique of the nonprofit industrial complex, because you have sometimes Native people who may need to work for an NGO in order to survive, in order to have access to cash or money, to pay rent, buy food, etc., because every other alternative economic avenue of survival has been foreclosed, literally foreclosed, through financing, through wealth capture, through land capture, through closure of the commons, and Native people not being allowed to live as Native people on their own lands, right? So, but once a Native or Native activist is part of the nonprofit industrial complex and becomes dependent upon the paycheck, they're being manipulated by their employer to not speak out and critique. So there is no avenue outside of this capture. The other sad thing about the United States is that as the United States has continued to defund public education at every level, including universities, it has been private industry that has to step in and fund universities in order for those universities to continue and survive. And thus universities shut down any sort of critique, inquiry, or research. They have the power to shut down the academic freedom, because that doesn't exist for academics anymore in the United States. But academics are punished or sometimes terminated in their university if they don't promote a neoliberal, settler colonial agenda that imagines this comfortable, wealthy settler futurity and erases the suffering of the poor and the suffering of Black people and the suffering of Native people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I started the gas activism partly because the resistance, it was the largest, I would say, environment movement of the neoliberal era in Australia, and absolutely the whitest one. And so the disappearance of Indigenous people from that moment of, a settler imagination of property invasion by corporations was really why I got involved in it, as someone who, was always professionalized as someone who assumed, the cultural industry in Australia imagines itself as being post-colonial, right, while living on colonized lands. And I think that, pointing to the educating around the intractability of it is really important, I think, yeah.
Christopher, I maybe then just to pick up on the work that you have been doing on across the pond, so to speak. I know you've been working to block gas infrastructure in the US, but also you've come over to Europe and you've been on the front lines here as well. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of collaboration and the impacts of that, at least back where you are, and maybe how you think you're having an effect here as well, because you are appearing here quite a lot now, it seems.
Thank you. I think it's just an accident of history. I've only actually physically been to Europe 2 times, but both of those times I've been in Europe, it has been to join in solidarity with European climate organizers, climate activists, in order to resist the ongoing dependency on fossil fuels, especially fracked gas. And that arose out of participating with both my tribe and tribal leadership and with local organizers in Brownsville in order to fight the build out of fracked gas infrastructure. And, that has also included, being employed by an American NGO. But I started anti-fracking work even when I wasn't working for an NGO, of course, because, being in solidarity with other Native people in their struggles against gas and oil infrastructure in Oklahoma, in North Dakota. It's my other Native and Indigenous relatives who taught me why and how to resist. And then all of a sudden it's like once you see the depth of this pain and this destruction, it becomes harder and harder to turn away, I think. At least that's been for me. And so, yeah, whatever effect I'm having, I don't want to take claim or credit over it, because I wouldn't have been able to do any of those things without, the teachings and the blessings of the leadership of my tribe. I wouldn't be able to do that without the community members, community activists, whether they're paid or not paid, to organize around this and try to get other community members educated and involved. If it weren't for all of the organizers working so hard, like especially for Ende Gelände last year in Germany, the organizers Fossilgasfällen in Gothenburg a couple of years before, it was there in Gothenburg that I was even able to meet Esteban, and we were trading notes about resistance across the globe to fracking and to frack gas. It's not just me. It's me using my voice when I'm invited knowing that I'm learning constantly still from so many other people, and everything is interrelated and interconnected, and it's by the grace and humanity of all these other people that I can even be here today.
Thank you. I'm just going to pick up on some things that have come in through the Q&A. And I think, Christopher, this sort of speaks a little to how you are also emphasizing Indigenous and Native understandings of the place that you're from, emphasizing the relations over, the way that the global economy has been constructed as a genocidal and as extractivist economy. And there is a question here about how, okay, I'm just going to read this out, but it says, please say a little bit about possible solutions. Renewable energy industry is also very extractive and polluting. For example, Ivan Pak's power plant in the US created a huge ecological disaster. Would our younger generation agree to save energy and stop mining Bitcoin, mint NFTs, speculating on crypto, etc.? I do think, I'm just skipping ahead, I do not think younger people can survive without technology. That is actually a biggest cause of all of this. What can be possible for solutions for all without creating a new destructive industry or new destructive economies? I might sort of expand that too. I wonder if any of you, Christopher, yourself, but if any of you have any thoughts on any of this, and I can see, Esteban, you've answered this also in the Q&A, so maybe you could voice some of these ideas.
Yeah, I'm not going to claim to have solutions, but we find the solutions together. I'm not going to set myself up as an authority. But we have to know that, for example, there have been some coal power plants in the United States that were shut down or slated to be shut down. And with the expansion of this completely pseudo-existing thing called metacurrency or Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, the amount of energy that the computer servers need to draw to keep that fictive idea even alive has restarted a couple of coal plants in the United States in order to create the energy to draw into Bitcoin. So, I mean, look, the concept of money is already fictitious, right? And now we're doing this double fiction of cryptocurrency, which is actually, so it claims it is fictive. However, it's having a real consequence by restarting old coal power plants in order to power these servers, even while there are people in the United States who aren't using the electricity. So, I mean, I'm split, to be honest. I'm split between, well, our ancestors 1,000 years ago lived without technology that we're used to now. They survived and they lived. Maybe they weren't as comfortable as the global north, but remember, there are billions of human beings on this planet that still don't live with the comfort that the global north does. So yes, I enjoy air conditioning. Yes, I enjoy technology and electricity. It is not necessary for human survival, and we need to remember that. We need to remember that. And this sort of realm that we've produced in this power relation where so many people are immiserated, it's like, oh, we have all these wonderful technological advances. How many people on the planet still don't have clean water or don't have electricity at all? There are Native people in the United States, as well as poor non-Native people in the United States, who do not have access to clean water. They have no health care. Even I have been homeless as a queer Native in the United States. Even I have been homeless and had to live in a tent. So it's a fiction that we even have this comfort, because this comfort of technology is violently controlled by wealth and white supremacy. Because there are, even to this day in the United States, the richest empire in the history of the planet that do not have shelter, water, clean water, and fracking is poisoning what little groundwater, fresh, clean groundwater is left, and destroying the capacity of the land to filter and keep clean water. Fracking must be globally illegal. It must be made illegal. But what drives it is this claim of progress and claim of technology. So we need to be a lot smarter about what technologies we forward, but we also have to remember that even with all this wonderful technology of food production, how many people on this planet live in abject famine? Even when we have the capacity to feed the planet. The answer is the exploitative global economy that we have, the nation states that prop up that economy, and the nation states that arise, the colonial nation states that arise from that exploitative, violent economy. We need to restore our humanity collectively, and the global system that's destroying comfort, happiness, the livelihoods of so many people on the planet, people in the global north, including myself as a native person who has been colonized, who's in the process of decolonizing, we need to understand that whatever comfort that we are enjoying right now on this panel is not universal and is at the expense. It is the European and global North wealth is at the impoverishment, the violent, forced impoverishment of the rest of the planet. And we need to relearn that. We need to learn that so deeply. You know, we need to learn that so deeply that the way we think about it, the technology is it's being driven by the profit motive. It's being driven by wealth accumulation. It's not being driven by the betterment of humanity so that all of humanity can live a better life. You know, in other words, technology is a weapon of death. It doesn't have to be, but it's our human understanding and use of that technology that turns it into a weapon of death, rather than as something that will elevate the comfort of all of humanity.
Esteban, I want to draw you into this a little bit because I know you've also said something in the chat about degrowth. Might that be another way to think about this?
Yeah, I think that Europe and the global North are facing an existential question. They have ruled the world, Europe has ruled the world for centuries, and even activists are still trapped in this Eurocentric trap, where they are the center of the world, the guardians of universality. They are the ones that will decide the way out of the climate crisis. And they're suffering for this because they do it with the best intention as far as they know. But they don't realize that the answer to the crisis lies outside of the framework that has led them to who they are. And that's a very difficult thing to realize that you don't know what you don't know, and that the only way out of that is humility. And that's not very common in Europe. I struggle a lot, and not just me, but many people, including white Europeans that get it, that are trying to help us decolonize the narratives and the climate movement to really put their money where their mouth is. Even in the Gelände, one of the most radical progressive movements, the structures of racism and colonialism are subconscious. And they repeat themselves every time systematically. We are exhausted of trying to bring this up over and over again. And you know what this leads me to realize is that we must take the lead, Christopher, Sumo, you know, BIPOC and Global South, MAPA, frontliners, we need to lead the way because Europe is lost. The answers to the climate crisis will not come from the place that originated the climate crisis. And what I was saying about degrowth, well, I lived in the US for 10 years. Now I'm living in Europe. And I can tell you that the level of consumption is disgusting. If you compare, you know, the word carbon footprint was created by BP. So not to be functional to them, but when you compare the carbon footprint of any inhabitant of Latin America, Africa, or most of Asia, it doesn't come even close to the carbon footprint of individuals and people consuming in the global north, especially the US, that has contributed, I think, if I remember right, nearly 40% of greenhouse gas emissions historically, right? And there's a car culture, it's a waste culture, then the amounts of garbage that are produced are like industrial levels by individuals. And here in Europe too, I'm in Berlin, a progressive place and so on, and people are against plastic and all that, but you go shopping and the only thing that is not plastic is the bag. Everything else is plastic. You buy tomatoes, they come in a plastic box, even elaborating things with a little twist to them. And it's just, and you know that the fracking industry, the fossil fuel industry is also behind that. So they are behind keeping you consuming that, and it's really hard to rebel and stop that because we are fighting symptoms of something that is structurally much bigger. And I don't want to take forever, but I agree with the point that was raised in the chat in the question. I think it would take a lot longer than a few minutes that we have to actually go deep into that. But I think that Europe, the global north, has a lot to learn from the global south. And I'm not saying that they should go back to living like 500 years ago, like Christopher was also saying, but reduce your consumption. The way of life in Europe and in the global north is unsustainable. And this may be the nail in the coffin for humanity, because it's easy to talk about fracking, talk about fossil fuels, yeah, as long as it doesn't touch your consumption. But I know that the moment that you're going to touch that, you're going to get a lot of flashback from people that are not necessarily politicized or aware of the climate impacts, and that's where the biggest danger lies. There are groups that are trying to put workers and common people against climate activists as if they were enemies, and it's really dangerous. So we need to work to bring us together. We're working now on a campaign connecting debt and climate to cancel the debts of the global south. And I'm not going to go into that because we don't have time. But that goes into a little deeper into fighting the structural inequalities that keep the global north enriching itself at the expense of the global south, deepening colonialism and making money out of interest on loans that were originally illegal in the first place and have been paid over many times. So the answers are complex, but those are my 2 cents on the topic.
Then, sorry, did someone else want to say something?
I just wanted to say, you know, it's also a kind of racial construction that Indigenous groups and Southern groups haven't been working on this question for a long time. There's so many experiments in off-grid and, you know, alternative energy communities that can be donated to, that can be, you know, asked what they want to be, you know, developing their projects. And I think, you know, the people in the film in Infractions are at the cutting edge actually of some of those experiments in their communities, and working not just with the climate movement, but with people really committed to alternative regional economy work and regional, you know, futurity thinking around climate-friendly communities. And so that's a long history of appropriate technological experimentation, you know, that exists, that doesn't need to be an existential binary question, I think. And a lot of the times when Europeans, I mean, I've lived in Europe for 10 years, and you know, part of it is a working through of this, you know, really important existential question. But if paralysis is the end point of that, you know, we get nowhere. And so the connectivity of these movements to the South that already exists. Like people can sign up to those groups that organize in European cities that are working very hard, going to stakeholder meetings in London and Geneva, etc. Like there's so many things that you can get involved in if your interest is in being in solidarity with those Indigenous groups, and inevitably you will learn about the more practical things that you can do by turning up, basically.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think that's really important because I think a lot of people do wonder about what they can practically do. And I think, as you say, by turning up, you will find out those things, because a lot of these things, as you say, are with specific communities, and they're not the kinds of big investments that, you know, governments are making either. And I just also, in a way, to pick a little bit up on that, Esteban, I know this is also something that's been asked in the chat, is because a lot of the way that LNG terminals are now being argued for in Europe, and I think also now in Australia, is that they'll be green hydrogen ready. I wonder if anyone can speak to that.
Yes, sure. Thank you for reminding us. So this is one of the biggest lies. It's called the hydrogen hype. And I responded with a report that is very good on the topic, debunking this lie. One of the biggest parts of the lie is that it's not technically feasible to reconvert these LNG terminals into hydrogen terminals. Hydrogen uses very different pressures, is much more dangerous, it's much more difficult to work with. And furthermore, does not even exist. More than 90% of all hydrogen that is produced is not green hydrogen, but blue and gray hydrogen, which is made from gas. So they're using this to greenwash the gas and fracking industry that they are really working on to advance for decades to come. And by turning it into hydrogen, they want to further sell it to us as green. But the reality is that more than 90% of all the hydrogen ever made is being made with the use of fossil fuels, which sometimes makes its carbon footprint even worse than using the original fossil fuel that made it in the first place. So this is the level of perversion that the fossil fuel industry, which is the real power behind the government, behind the media, behind the throne, is the concentrated power of the fossil fuel industry that is willing to throw humanity and the planet under the bus to perpetrate profits until however long they can. And when they no longer can, they will pull out their money and I guess move to Mars, because there will be no planet left to inhabit. They're going to throw all of us into civil wars. They're funding Trump. They're funding the white supremacists everywhere. They're behind fueling division and hatred in society, because in a world that is in crisis, financial and social crises, it's a lot harder to make any climate and environmental gains. Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion were born at a time when Europe was in relative stability. Give it a few more years of war and civil war and financial crisis. The last topic people will talk about is the climate, and anyone who dares to do that will be labeled as an enemy of the people who is preventing you from putting food on the table of your family. That's why we need to seize the moment now. Time is running out. And I just want to make a plea that we all come together from Australia, Texas, Latin America, Africa, and Europe, because you have the power here. These are the centers of power where many of the multinational climate criminals are headquartered, and we can stop them if we all come together.
Does anyone else have something to add to that?
I see that Rachel is unmuted. Rachel, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay. I also want to say another false solution that's being marketed to us as a greenwashing is carbon capture. In fact, like these LNG export terminals are being sort of marketed like, you please approve and give permits to these projects because, oh, we're going to make it green. We're going to make it as green as possible. We're going to put carbon capture facilities at our export terminals to reduce our carbon load. It's like, well, you need to use energy to capture that carbon. So you're actually increasing the amount of fossil gas you have to consume in order to literally fuel the processes of capturing, separating and sequestering and capturing that carbon. Plus, how are you going to make a facility? Oh, we're going to make holes underneath the ground and shoot all this carbon in there. Well, you're not solving the problem. You're not, these companies are not doing their due diligence by studying geologically if it's even possible to do that. And if you're going to be making an unnatural artificial container underneath the ground to put carbon gas, it's going to escape. So it's going to get out into the atmosphere just by nature of it being a gas. It's another false solution that's being marketed as a climate solution or as something that'll help the situation when it's not. It's just a marketing gimmick. So these gas and oil companies can say that they're being green or say that they're trying to do something about the situation. It's really awful. And then you have like riders put into American legislation that says, well, the government wants to fund climate solutions. Oh, we have this carbon capture as a solution. Oh, here's money. So taxes that are being drawn from the population are now being used, or continue to be used to subsidize the oil and gas industry in the United States, which, as I said, is private mostly. And none of that wealth is ever redistributed. So our tax money is literally being used to subsidize the oil and gas industry, which only makes a few people extraordinarily wealthy while destroying the land. And then it's like, well, we got to make green hydrogen, we got to make carbon capture and storage. All of those are false solutions. We simply need to consume radically less when it comes to fossil fuels.
Thanks, Christopher. It also just reminded me, Rachel, that I did actually want to ask you that on one side there is this false solution of gas being this sort of transitional need, but I think Rachel also, because Australia has significant offshore gas, conventional gas, yet it is fracking, it's expanding fracking. I wonder if you could maybe explain some of that too.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up actually on the question of false solutions and easy solutions. The carbon capture and storage is one thing. The entire Beetaloo Basin fracking, all of the fracking that's in Fractions film, planned. None of there's only a few exploration wells at the moment, but it's planned as a major field if it goes ahead. All of that was approved on the basis of 135 regulatory changes to the regulatory environment. And one of them was offsetting the entire gas fields emissions, which is empirically impossible, right? Anyone reading that would know, okay, that's empirically impossible. So how do they think they're going to rationalize doing this? And the jurisdictional politics of this are extremely perverse and extremely creative. And when you look backwards how these projects are approved, you can go all the way back to all of the legal innovations of colonization that made everything seem legal since the history, since the 1500s, right? Something that they came up with to deal with the total impossibility of offsetting the carbon accounts for this project was they invented an entirely new category of offset called an indirect offset. And what that meant was there's literally not enough, you couldn't plant enough trees to offset all of the gas in this project. You couldn't give enough carbon credits to Indigenous farmers or Indigenous burning processes. It's not even there, it's not even close to being there, right? So they had to fabricate some other conceptual solution that is completely immaterial to deal with this offset problem. And what they did was they decided to create a kind of R&D space for an offset, where they would give taxpayers money to researchers to develop ways of making gas cleaner in the future if it isn't clean now. So that's, you know, researching carbon capture and storage, researching it's basically giving research money to the gas industry. And you know, to their credit, there's a really wonderful group of young parents in Darwin who called Parents for Climate Action, and they campaigned daily at the offices of the two guys that came up with this indirect offset concept, and they camped there every day and campaigned against they campaigned against the whole project, but against some of the legal and policy solutions that they were trying to do to kind of rationalize it. And now that category of offset is off the table because of their activism. Of course, it was ridiculous to start with, but you know, all of these things, if people don't have time in their workday to think about what that is, they don't know how ridiculous they are because it sounds legitimate, right? So that kind of work is really important, even though it feels like a total waste of time, because you're arguing with totally irrational, immaterial concepts that have no basis in reality whatsoever. The point about the offshore gas is actually dirtier than the onshore gas. If you actually, you know, if you took both of them and burned them at a Bunsen burner, which is how the gas industry measures its cleanliness, it has nothing to do with how gas performs in the real world. But if you only did that, the offshore gas is much dirtier than the onshore gas, actually, and there's much more of it. So it would be a disaster to mine, to open up that gas field, and it's right near. Juridically, it's not fully crossing over the territories of the Tiwi Island people, but all of that sea territory is part of their fishing territory. And so it would also be a disaster for the Tiwi Islanders and many other island communities around that offshore infrastructure to be exploiting that gas field as well. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the kind of onshore settler activists imagined the ocean in a different way as a, you know, and historically the ocean and the rivers have been basically imagined as dumps by settler infrastructure. And so that's also a lot of the re-education that is happening in those spaces is about fully connecting onshore and offshore water, which is, you know, is in the air as well as on the ground, and thinking about the, you know, the internationalism of these water flows as well.
Yes. Just picking up, well, we've got a couple more minutes left. I just quickly want to pick up one of these questions again in the Q&A. Does anyone have anything to say about nuclear as being offered as another clean alternative?
Yes, I feel very passionately about that. It's been a long time since I took high school chemistry and high school physics, but just looking at the half-life of our radioactive metals and materials should tell us that nuclear is not clean in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, there's a long history of mining uranium in indigenous lands and near indigenous communities in the United States. And then the tailings from that mining are not adequately cleaned up because, of course, white America is like, well, these native people, they don't matter. So they leave these nuclear tailings and this nuclear waste just out in the wind to be blown around and harm Diné people, Navajo people, to harm Laguna people, to harm other native people, and have extremely high levels of birth defects in indigenous and native human beings. Nuclear radiation is not clean. It'll always be available to disaster. Fukushima, we don't hear about the Fukushima disaster in the news anymore, but it's still leaking radioactive poison and waste into the environment, and they just want to dump it in the oceans. You know, there is no solution. And, you know, what's the half-life of uranium? I don't remember, but it's measured in thousands of years. So let's change that. How many hundreds of human lifetimes is the half-life of uranium? Okay, so after that time, does that mean uranium is no longer poisonous or deadly or dangerous? No, it just means that it's decaying at a rate that you'll have half of the radioactive mass over that amount of time. You know, nuclear is not a solution. And if you take into consideration the mining of uranium and how that kills Native and Indigenous people all over the world where uranium mining happens, it's just as genocidal and extractive. It's not clean. It's not clean in any way, shape, or form. And to think that it's a clean or a green solution, that it's something that can power our overconsumption of energy, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I want to remind the world that the United States of America is a fascist empire. It has murdered its Native and Indigenous people. It has stolen people from another continent to build its wealth. And it is the only nation in human history at this point that has used nuclear weapons to commit crimes against humanity on another people. And yeah, I have very strong emotions about this. Anybody who thinks that nuclear energy can be clean or safe or anything like that is extremely narrow-minded and does not understand history.
Yes, thank you, Krista. So we only have a couple more minutes left. Sonia, I wondered if you might want to come on and wrap us up.
Thank you, Sumugan. Yeah, I mean, thank you very much to all of you, to our panelists for joining us today in a very deep and intertwined discussion that crossed between a number of different contexts. I think that kind of detail and that kind of precise analysis, embodied analysis, is particularly important when we're dealing with a situation at a moment where economies are dominated by so-called social governmental criteria, i.e. greenwash. We need this precise thinking in order to be clear about not only the crises that we're in, but also the way that they're interconnected in order to set up other models of solidarity. And I think that also, yeah, just to summarize, because I guess it's also nice to draw things together. For me, what was most important was that connections were called out between corporate capitalism, white supremacy, and environmental racism. That it's incredibly urgent that the privileged global north, white people in the privileged global north, step back and show humility when facing up to these struggles, and the urgency of privileging BIPOC and Indigenous voices in that moment where struggle is narrativized. And then, as I also mentioned, that it's so important to call out the nonsense of so-called false solutions or marketed green capitalism. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that panelists brought this up, and also that that was something that was brought up by people who attended in the Q&A. Thank you also to all of you who came to the event today. I also want to express appreciation of the fact that not only the panelists, but I think also some attendees are attending across different time zones. So thank you for getting up at uncomfortable hours to join us. I wanted to make a shout out for a number of groups that the Infractions film involves. I'm going to paste a link into the chat at the moment, which brings you to the website of Rachel O'Reilly's documentation Infractions, where you can find a number of groups, including Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Coalition, who have been really important in doing frontline activism against fracking in the Northern Territory in particular. And somebody wrote early on in the event and asked for a recording of this event will be shared. We will put the video online and we'll send an email out to attendees at some point in the next week or two with a link, so you can access it and share it with other people if you wish. And Esteban also very generously sent us the PDF of his presentation. So if anyone's interested to have a closer look at the information, and I think there are also a lot more spreadsheets to that presentation that he couldn't include, I'm just going to type my private email into the chat. Just drop me a line and I'll send it to you. I think that's it for now. Just a small advertisement for next week's panel. I believe one of the panelists for next week also attended today's discussion, which is fantastic. And it also draws on a number of the topics that were addressed towards the end of the discussion today. We're going to be focusing on decolonial perspectives on climate and environmental justice. The panel is called Entanglements of Social, Environmental and Climate Justice with Ayo Akinwande, who is one of the artists of the exhibition, Rebecca Abena Kennedy Asante from Black Earth Kollektiv, Fossil Free Culture in the Netherlands, and will be moderated by Aisha Garin. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all there. Before I close, a big thank you to our technical support, Linus Kaufhold, and to Prata Gallery and the staff of the gallery for hosting this event, and also a big thank you again to Sumugan for moderating. So with that, I think round things off and wish you all a pleasant evening / day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you.
Nanapale, ayema paesa.